When three famous YouTube influencers decided to explore the abandoned Ravenswood Mental Hospital for their latest video, they had no idea their pursuit of views and likes would turn into a harrowing fight for survival. This wasn't just any old haunted building. Ravenswood had a dark past, filled with unspeakable experiments and a legacy of madness that refused to stay buried. Cameron, Lisa, and Jake were at the top of their game, known for their daring and often reckless stunts. Their followers loved the adrenaline rush, the thrill of watching them push boundaries. Ravenswood Mental Hospital, closed for decades after a series of mysterious deaths, was the perfect location for their Halloween special. Located on the outskirts of a forgotten town, Ravenswood was established in the early 1900s as a state-of-the-art psychiatric facility. However, rumors of unethical treatments and brutal experiments quickly began to circulate. By the 1960s, the hospital had gained a reputation for being a place of horror, where patients were subjected to nightmarish conditions. It was finally shut down in 1983 after several unexplained deaths and accusations of malpractice. Equipped with cameras, flashlights, and an Ouija board, the trio entered the crumbling building. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Graffiti covered the walls, and broken furniture littered the floors. Despite their bravado, a sense of dread settled over them as they ventured deeper into the hospital. The trio set up their equipment in what used to be the common area for patients. The sun had set, and the hospital was plunged into darkness. The room was eerily silent, save for the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. They decided to start with the Ouija board, hoping to contact any lingering spirits. As they began to ask questions, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out chilling messages. "Leave now," and "danger" flashed across the board. Lisa, always the skeptic, accused Cameron of moving it, but his pale face and trembling hands told a different story. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from upstairs. Jake, always eager for excitement, grabbed his camera and ran towards the noise, with Lisa and Cameron reluctantly following. They found a broken window, shattered glass glistening in the moonlight. But what caught their attention was a trail of bloody footprints leading down the hall. Jake's camera captured everything as they followed the footprints. They led to a room with a heavy metal door. The sign above it read, "Experimental Ward." The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with old medical equipment and rusted restraints. The walls were covered in disturbing drawings, seemingly made by a patient in extreme distress. As they explored the room, Lisa found a journal hidden under a pile of debris. It belonged to Dr. Isaac Thorne, the hospital's chief psychiatrist. The journal detailed horrific experiments conducted on the patients, attempting to unlock the secrets of the human mind through torture and deprivation. The final entry was a cryptic warning. "They are still here, watching, waiting." The temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible. A chilling voice echoed through the room, whispering, "You shouldn't have come." The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. Hours passed with no escape in sight. The trio started to turn on each other, their fear and paranoia intensifying. Cameron insisted they had to leave, while Jake was determined to capture more footage. Lisa, clutching Dr. Thorne's journal, seemed to be losing her grip on reality, muttering about the experiments and the patient's suffering. As tensions rose, they heard footsteps approaching. A shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. It was a patient, his eyes wild and his clothes tattered. He babbled incoherently about the doctor's return and the endless pain. Before they could react, he lunged at Jake, knocking the camera from his hands. In the struggle, Jake hit his head and fell unconscious. Lisa and Cameron managed to subdue the patient and drag Jake to another room. As they tended to his injury, they heard more voices, patients calling out for help, begging for release. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air thick with despair. Lisa, now fully engrossed in the journal, claimed she knew how to appease the spirits. She believed they had to perform a ritual to release the trapped souls. Cameron was skeptical, but saw no other option. They gathered the necessary items from around the hospital: candles, a scalpel, and an old patient gown. As they began the ritual, the spirits grew more agitated. Shadows flitted across the walls, and the temperature plummeted further. Jake regained consciousness just as Lisa started chanting from the journal. The room filled with a blinding light, and a deafening roar shook the building. When the light faded, the trio found themselves back in the common area. The spirits were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. They stumbled out of the hospital, their equipment forgotten. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon as they reached their car. Exhausted and traumatized, they drove away in silence. The footage they had captured was too disturbing to share, and they agreed to keep their experience a secret. The cost of their adventure had been too high, and they wanted nothing more than to forget Ravenswood ever existed. Back home, they tried to return to their normal lives, but the events of that night haunted them. Lisa became obsessed with Dr. Thorne's journal, convinced there were more secrets to uncover. Cameron and Jake distanced themselves from her, unable to cope with the memories. Months later, Lisa disappeared without a trace. Her friends feared the worst, but they knew better than to go looking for her. They suspected she had returned to Ravenswood, unable to resist its dark pull. Years passed, and the trio's story became an urban legend among thrill-seekers and ghost hunters. Ravenswood remained abandoned, a monument to the horrors of the past. But those who dared to venture inside swore they could still hear the whispers of the lost souls and the faint sound of a camera clicking in the dark. In the heart of New York City, where the skyline pierced the heavens and the streets buzzed with life, St. Augustine Hospital stood as a beacon of modern medicine. Yet, despite its sterling reputation, a shadow of controversy loomed over its gleaming facade. 6 months ago, an unusual death shook the hospital's foundation. A patient, recovering from a routine surgery, had died unexpectedly. The cause of death was officially listed as cardiac arrest, but whispers among the staff suggested something far more sinister. Rumors circulated that the patient, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, had been speaking of strange visions before her untimely demise. She had claimed to see ghostly figures lurking in the corners of her room, their hollow eyes watching her every move. Her screams for help had echoed through the ward, only to be dismissed by the nurses as delirium from her medication. When Sarah died, her family demanded an investigation, but the hospital swiftly closed the case, attributing her death to medical complications. However, those who had been on duty that night knew the truth. They had felt the cold presence in the room, had seen the flicker of lights, and had heard the whispers that sent chills down their spines. Some of the nurses resigned shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something unnatural had taken Sarah's life. But the incident was buried, forgotten by the public, and the hospital moved on, or so it seemed. Dr. Emily Harrison had always been known for her skepticism, a rationalist to the core. She had little patience for superstition or the unexplained. As an emergency room physician at St. Augustine, she was focused on the science of medicine, not ghost stories. But tonight, something felt off. It was a cold November evening, and a thick fog had settled over the city, making the world outside the hospital seem distant and surreal. The emergency room was unusually quiet, with only a few patients scattered about. Emily took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had been building inside her since she had arrived for her shift. "Dr. Harrison," a nurse called out, breaking the silence. "We have a new patient coming in. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures." Emily nodded and quickly prepared herself for the incoming case. Moments later, the paramedics rushed in, wheeling a man in his late 30s on a gurney. His face was bloodied, and his breathing was shallow. "What happened?" Emily asked, as she began examining the patient. "Car accident," one of the paramedics replied. "He crashed into a tree. No signs of alcohol or drugs, but he was delirious when we found him. Kept talking about seeing someone on the road before he lost control." Emily frowned. "Someone on the road?" "Yeah, but there was no one there when we arrived," the paramedic said, his voice low. It was strange. As they worked to stabilize the patient, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unsettling energy in the air, like the hospital itself was holding its breath. Later that night, as Emily was making her rounds, she noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by the shadows. The figure was dressed in a hospital gown, their head lowered as if in prayer. "Excuse me," Emily called out, her voice echoing down the empty corridor. The figure didn't move. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As she got closer, she realized that the person was a woman with long, tangled hair obscuring her face. The gown she wore was stained with dark, dried blood. "Ma'am, are you lost? Can I help you?" Emily asked, reaching out to touch the woman's shoulder. The moment her hand made contact, the woman jerked her head up, revealing a gaunt, pale face with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Emily's soul. The air around them grew cold, and Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Suddenly, the woman let out a low, guttural moan, her mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. Emily stumbled back in shock, her heart racing. The lights in the hallway flickered, and when they came back on, the woman was gone. Emily stood there, trembling, trying to convince herself that it had been a hallucination. But the image of that terrifying face was burned into her mind. The next day, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. She confided in her colleague, Dr. Michael Reed, who had been working at St. Augustine for over a decade. "Michael, have you ever seen anything unusual here?" Emily asked, trying to sound casual. Michael looked at her with a knowing expression. "You mean the ghosts?" Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Michael sighed and leaned back in his chair. "This hospital has a history, Emily. It was built in the early 1900s, and back then, it was a mental asylum. They treated patients with some pretty barbaric methods, lobotomies, electroshock therapy, you name it. A lot of people died here under terrible circumstances." Emily listened, horrified. She had known St. Augustine was old, but she had no idea about its dark past. "Over the years, there have been reports of strange occurrences," Michael continued. "Patients and staff seeing things that shouldn't be there, hearing voices, feeling cold spots. Some say the spirits of those who died here never left." Emily felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. "And you believe in this?" Michael shrugged. "I've seen some things I can't explain. But whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that this place has an unsettling atmosphere." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the encounter with the woman in her mind, wondering if she was one of the spirits Michael had mentioned. The thought of spending another night in the hospital filled her with dread. The following week, the strange occurrences continued. Emily began to notice odd things happening around the hospital. Medical equipment malfunctioning, lights flickering, doors opening and closing on their own. Patients complained of hearing whispers in the night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. One evening, Emily was working late in her office when she heard a soft tapping on the door. She looked up, expecting to see a nurse or a colleague, but there was no one there. "Hello," she called out, but there was no response. She stood up and walked to the door, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. Shaking her head, she closed the door and returned to her desk. But as soon as she sat down, the tapping started again, louder this time. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly opened the door once more. This time, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, standing in the middle of the hallway, was the woman from before, her face twisted in that same grotesque smile. Emily gasped and slammed the door shut, her hands shaking. She backed away, trying to catch her breath, when suddenly, the door burst open, and the woman lunged at her. Emily screamed, stumbling back and falling to the floor. But when she looked up, the woman was gone. The room was empty, the door still ajar. Emily scrambled to her feet, her body trembling with fear. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She needed answers. The next day, Emily sought out Michael and told him everything that had happened. "I can't keep working here if this continues," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to know what we're dealing with." Michael listened intently, his expression serious. "There's an old file room in the basement," he said. "It has records dating back to when this place was an asylum. Maybe we can find something there." Together, they descended into the dark, musty basement, the air thick with dust and decay. The file room was a small, cramped space, filled with stacks of old, yellowed papers and crumbling file cabinets. They spent hours sifting through the records, searching for any information that could explain the hauntings. Finally, Emily came across a file that caught her attention. "Michael, look at this," she said, holding up a file labeled Patient 413. The file contained the records of a woman named Margaret Walters, who had been admitted to the asylum in 1928. According to the records, Margaret had been committed after suffering a mental breakdown. She had claimed to see visions of her deceased husband, who had died in a car accident a year earlier. She was treated with electroshock therapy and lobotomized. Emily read aloud, her voice shaking. But the treatments didn't work. She became violent, attacking the staff and other patients. Eventually, she was placed in solitary confinement, where she died of unknown causes. Michael frowned. "That must be her, the woman you've been seeing." Emily felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Margaret had been a victim of the cruel, inhumane treatments of the time. Her spirit had likely been trapped in the hospital, reliving her torment for nearly a century. "We have to do something," Emily said, her voice firm. "We have to help her find peace." Michael hesitated, looking at Emily with a mixture of concern and reluctance. "Emily, this isn't something we can just handle ourselves. We need to bring in someone who knows how to deal with this kind of thing. A professional." Emily frowned. "You mean, like an exorcist?" Michael nodded. "There's a priest, Father O'Leary, who specializes in this sort of thing. He's dealt with cases of possession and hauntings before. If anyone can help, it's him." Reluctant but desperate, Emily agreed to contact Father O'Leary. When she met him, she was struck by how ordinary he appeared. He was an older man with silver hair and kind, weary eyes, dressed in a simple clerical collar. But there was a quiet strength about him, a confidence that made Emily feel slightly more at ease. Father O'Leary listened intently as Emily and Michael described the events that had transpired. When they finished, he nodded gravely. "I've encountered spirits like Margaret's before," he said. "Spirits trapped by unresolved trauma, unable to move on. They can become vengeful, lashing out at the living in their confusion and pain." "What can we do?" Emily asked, her voice small. "The only way to help her is to perform a rite of exorcism," Father O'Leary explained. "We must cleanse the hospital of the dark energy that binds her here and guide her spirit toward the light." That night, they gathered in the old psychiatric ward. in the very room where Margaret had died. Father O'Leary brought holy water, incense, and a worn leather-bound Bible. The room was heavy with an oppressive silence, the air thick with the scent of decay. Father O'Leary began the ritual, chanting in Latin, his voice steady and calm. As he sprinkled holy water around the room, the temperature dropped, and the lights flickered violently. A low, guttural moan echoed through the walls, growing louder and more frantic. Suddenly, the room erupted into chaos. The bed frame began to shake, the rusty springs creaking and groaning. Objects flew off the shelves, smashing against the walls. The oppressive energy in the room intensified, pressing down on them with an almost physical force. "Margaret," Father O'Leary called out, his voice firm, "you must let go of your pain. It's time to move on. Find peace in the light of God." The moaning grew louder, more desperate, and the air filled with the sound of distant, anguished cries. Emily felt a cold hand brush against her cheek, and she shuddered, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the center of the room. Margaret, her gaunt face twisted in agony, her hollow eyes filled with sorrow. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "help me." Father O'Leary stepped forward, holding up the Bible. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this place and find peace." For a moment, the room was silent, and then, slowly, Margaret's figure began to fade. Her twisted expression softened into one of sadness and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she disappeared into the darkness. Emily and Michael stood there in the silence, the air around them suddenly warm and still. The hospital felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. In the days following the exorcism, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, the strange occurrences now a thing of the past. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something within her had changed. She had faced her deepest fears, and in doing so, had also uncovered the weight of unresolved pain. One evening, as she was leaving the hospital, Emily paused at the entrance and looked back. For a moment, she thought she saw Margaret standing at the end of the hallway, her face serene and peaceful. Emily smiled, knowing that Margaret had finally found the peace she had been searching for, and in a way, so had she. St. Augustine Hospital had many stories, and this was just one of them. But Emily knew that, no matter what, she would face whatever came her way with strength and compassion. After all, she was a healer, and that was what she was meant to do.